And I really want to thank the co-op for hosting. It's always fun to work together because we have the same goals in mind, which is helping people be their absolute healthiest. Okay, let's see here. Oops, sorry. So just a little bit about me. This is my practice, Catalyst Health Center for Functional Medicine. It's here in Sacramento. And I'm a certified functional medicine practitioner and a medical doctor with a degree from UC Davis. And I'll tell you a little bit more about my story coming up. But first, I want to tell you about one of my patients. And this is actually a very typical story. Carol came to me, actually, she attended a co-op talk some time ago and heard me talking about this and recognized herself in a lot of what I was discussing. But Carol's story is that she had been having abdominal pain, weight gain, but a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, and was struggling with increasing gastrointestinal symptoms, really a whole lot of problems that just the list kept growing. And no matter what she did, she was just getting more diagnoses and feeling worse. And when she saw me talk about this, she realized that made sense to her, that there really was a big connection. And after working together, she's had a complete transformation of her health. Her depression is gone, her anxiety is gone, her gastrointestinal symptoms have totally resolved, and she's lost weight, which she said that was a bonus. She wasn't looking for that. And her memory, that was another issue she was having, was really starting to have cognitive issues. And that was a real problem for her work. And that has totally changed as well. And so how was that possible? Well, tonight I'm going to explain all this, the importance of this connection between the gut and the brain. And then I will tell you at the end about what we did in her particular case. And it'll make sense after you understand the content from tonight's talk. So the whole idea here is to harness the natural healing force in each of us. That's the goal of the work I do, because that's the best way to get better. And I am a functional medicine practitioner, as I mentioned, and it's all about that idea. And to do that work, we use a personalized systems-based approach, and it utilizes advanced testing and also looking at the kind of common conventional testing, but with a different lens of what is optimal, not just what labels you as with having a disease. And really listening carefully and getting an in-depth history so we can make all the connections as to what led to your current situation, so we can untangle that knot and get you back to health. We work with the natural healing processes of your own body. And a lot of what we do to get you there, to get you well, is utilize nutrition and lifestyle interventions, because that's what actually works. So key concepts in this approach are to recognize that multiple causes lead to chronic conditions. This is really, really important. This is an important mindset shift to go through if you want to really get well. And that's because we are in our conventional approach, we're in this mindset of like, what is the single cause of this problem? And this makes sense when you look at the history of medicine, and really the roots of our current situation, our current model, are acute illness and infectious disease. So what is the bug causing this problem? And then what's the pill that's going to kill that bug? And that works for a lot of acute illness, but it doesn't work for chronic illness, because that's not how we develop chronic illness. There are multiple factors adding up into a perfect storm. There are many common patterns, but everybody's constellation of causes is slightly different. But these common patterns really manifest as inflammation, which I'll be talking about more. Another key concept is the microbiome, which is really the focus of tonight's talk. Your individual genetics play a very big role. Cellular energy production is important for healing, and the role of detoxification, and the role of the environment. And when I say environment, I mean much more than the air and the water we're having, we're breathing and drinking, but also the food we're eating every day, the light exposure we have, the relationships we're in, the toxins in our home. So it means a lot of things. So, I am so fortunate that I get to practice this way. I just love it. I mean, just the last few days, I've been working with several new patients where it's so exciting to help them see how they got to where they're at and how we're going to get them out of that. And I didn't always get to do this. So I have a conventional background. I was trained as a psychiatrist, and through, and I'm a medical doctor, allopathic medical doctor. And I really enjoyed my education because I was like very excited about why does disease happen? And I loved learning in medical school. But the further along I got, and especially in residency, it became less about why and more about labeling a constellation of symptoms as a disease and then matching that to a pill to treat it. And that was not as satisfying because when I would ask why does this patient get schizophrenia, for example, the answer was like, well, we don't really know. And then that was it, the end of the conversation. And when I discovered the power of nutrition through my sister's health journey, actually, it really changed everything because I saw that there was so much possible. And I started to understand more of the why of what's going wrong in the body and how we can actually fix that. And that led me to functional medicine. And, I had a really big paradigm shift occur. My training was with the mindset of like that we're fighting a battle. It's a war against illness. I mean, you hear about the war on drugs. Well, there's like the war on cancer. It's this battle mentality. But really, we are supposed to be healthy. And when I read a lot of the anthropological research and saw that hunter-gatherer tribes didn't have our kind of chronic illnesses, and that historical peoples didn't deal with the same kind of chronic illness, it really opened my eyes that, evolutionarily, we are meant to be healthy, and that there's a mismatch with our environment and our genes if we're having these chronic diseases. This changed everything for me. So I realized that, if I could help people fix that gap and mend that mismatch, that we would really help the body do its own healing, which it's actually always trying to do. And so I got my training in functional medicine, was able to combine the best of my background in conventional medicine with my new understanding of the role of nutrition and lifestyle and how inflammation really occurs and creates these symptoms, to be able to apply that now every day in my practice and get to see wonderful health transformations. And people will come for depression or anxiety and end up having a whole host of symptoms resolve, which is the opposite of the experience I had when I was treating only with medication, because it's a symptom reducing Band-Aid and often gives you more problems, side effects. So I love this approach, and I'm so grateful that I got to learn this and that I get to share this with my patients, and I get to share a piece of it with you tonight. So here's one of my favorite guys. I have a lot of quotes from him. All disease begins in the gut. I think that's not 100% true, but I think it's pretty close. The gut is so important, and you're going to see why tonight. I want to begin with just a basic explanation of how your gut works so that this makes more sense. First, you have to realize that you are actually a donut. And what do I mean by that? Well, your gut is like a tube running through your whole body that is exposed to the outside environment. It's exposed to whatever you're putting in your body. And that means it has a very complicated job. It has to decide what it's going to let in, and it has to let in all the right nutrients, but it also has to keep out dangerous toxins and bacteria and infections that shouldn't be there. Here's a diagram of the human digestive system. And I want to just point out a few things. And I want to also say that, I just picked a new diagram for this talk tonight. I've had other ones before. And every time I go looking for a nice diagram of the human digestive system, most of them do not include the head. And this is a real pet peeve of mine, because digestion begins, you might think, in your mouth, and you're pretty close. The mouth is pretty important, but it actually begins in your brain. When you look at the food, when you smell it, when you anticipate eating, that's what begins digestion. That begins your release of salivary enzymes in your saliva. It begins your production of stomach acid to prepare for the food. That is all really, really important. So the food is going to be chewed and mixed with some of the initial digestive enzymes in your mouth. Amylase is the enzyme there that breaks down starch. And it's going to be moistened by the saliva, and you're going to swallow, and it's going to hit the stomach. And there needs to be sufficient stomach acid there to help break down food further and to activate one of the digestive enzymes, pepsin, and also to help you facilitate digesting or absorbing key vitamins like B12 and iron. Without enough stomach acid, you can't get those into your body. Then the food passes into the small intestine. And if it's not acidic enough, You will not release the digestive enzymes from your pancreas that are so important for breaking down and absorbing food. So again, that stomach acid is critical. And unfortunately, when people have reflux, all the treatments are focused on reducing stomach acid. Well, of course, it's a problem to have acid going up into your esophagus, but you do need stomach acid, so that's not the best solution. So after you have broken down the food and into tiny little constituents like amino acids or glucose or individual little fat molecules, you absorb that into your bloodstream. Then the food that could not be digested, which is the fiber, passes on to the large intestine where it is broken down by your gut microbiome, which we'll be discussing more. And a lot of water is reabsorbed in the large intestine as well. A lot is going on there, but that's an overview of digestion. Now, the lining of your small intestine has an enormous surface area, and that's because of that job it has to absorb so much nutrients. And it achieves this large surface area by all these ridges and folds, and then these little projections called microvilli. This is kind of like shag carpeting, and that gives it a much bigger surface area. And you can see under that lining, there is the blood vessels right there, and that's so important for, that's where the nutrients are going to be absorbed into and mobilized from throughout your body. So your GI tract has a lot of components. It's got the lining cells, those are epithelial cells. It has smooth muscle cells to do the contractions to move the food along through the gastrointestinal system. It has neurons to coordinate that muscle movement. And there's a lot of immune cells there. In fact, a majority of your immune system is focused in your gut because it has that patrol job, that interface with the outside environment. And it, that your intestinal lining is only one cell thick. So it's got to really be patrolling. That surface area adds up, and it's about the size of a badminton court. Now, the small intestine is, like I said, where most of the nutrients are absorbed, and your immune system there is recognizing the different bacteria and parasites and viruses and deciding who it needs to try to fight off and mount an immune response to. Now, your large intestine houses the majority of your microbiome, which is all the bugs that live in you, which we're going to go into more detail. That's where most of it is. Now, the gut microbiome has really been making headlines in recent years, and it may be part of why you signed up to come to this talk, because you've heard there is this connection between the gut and many things, and in this case, the gut and the brain. But these are just some headlines that I plucked from different sources. I mean, it's just all over the news. Researchers are finding out new things every day about this connection. You can really Google any chronic illness and microbiome, and you're going to find some kind of paper. It's been linked to all kinds of illnesses and symptoms. So autoimmune diseases of all kinds, skin issues, hormonal problems, infertility, neurological diseases. I should also include on there Alzheimer's disease, that's very much linked to this, and psychiatric disorders, which we're focused on tonight. And not just depression and anxiety, but also schizophrenia, ADHD, autism, and more. It's really connected to everything. So this idea that our brain is encased in this super safe blood-brain barrier and is somehow immune to whatever else is going on in the body is not accurate at all. It's one body. So what is this microbiome I've been talking about? Well, it's over 100 trillion microbes. It's found all over your body, in every cavity, on every surface. Most of it, though, is in the large intestine, as I said, about 99%. And it consists of bacteria, archaea, yeast, and viruses. And historically also usually consisted of some kind of parasites, protozoa, or worms even. When you add it all up, it weighs about 2 to 3 pounds. And I think of it as another organ in the body because it's helpful to think of it that way. It's something we need to be mindful of and think about taking care of. Everybody's gut microbiome is unique. Nobody has the exact same accumulation of different species. Everybody's got a different sort of signature of diverse bacteria and microbes. There isn't one single species that's present in all of us in this virtual room. And there's not one single healthy biome. That it can look very different for different people and still be healthy. There are some, of course, key factors, but diversity and difference is normal. So the Human Genome Project thought it was going to really figure out a lot of what was going on with disease. And it was a bit surprising to find out we only had 23,000 genes. And that's not really that much different than like a banana. So how can we have all this complexity? Well, we have outsourced a great deal of our complexity to microbes. And you can see here, there's like 2 million microbial genes. And they are doing a lot of different jobs for us. We co-evolved with them and we need them. We need the right ones in the right amounts. That's very, very important. How did we get our microbiome? Well, historically and ideally, you get it from vaginal birth. The mom's microflora is passed to the baby that way. And then also breastfeeding also is a key factor in conveying some of the first keystone bacteria like bifidobacteria. There are modern factors then that do impact that microbiome that a baby gets. And these are, you know, unfortunate side effects. They're not certainly, it was not something anyone kind of realized when we started saving lives with C-section that this could be a side effect, and C-sections do save lives. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad about that. It's just to realize that there are unintended consequences. And sometimes we give antibiotics during childbirth because of like premature rupture of membranes or other issues. And that can have impacts as well because that's killing off the mom's microflora that needs to be passed to the baby. And other factors will change the microbiome as well. It's fascinating to me that the mother's microflora actually change in the last couple of weeks before childbirth. There seems to be some evolutionary component here of shifting what bacteria are going to be given to the baby. So baby born, you know, quite prematurely, maybe more than like 3 or 4 weeks premature, is going to get a different microbiome. And then formula feeding is also going to influence the microbiome because it's got different components to it. Breast milk is really interestingly designed partly for the baby, but there are things in breast milk that are designed just to feed the infant's bacteria. There's another factor we think that plays a role in the microbiome, and that is this concept of the hygiene hypothesis or the old friends hypothesis. And this is that we've become so careful about hygiene that we've actually diminished our exposure to healthy bacteria and just the microbiome we would have got otherwise. There certainly are studies that show that children who grow up on a farm or have a dog have a more diverse microbiome. And this is tricky because obviously we've really benefited from hygiene as well. It's made a huge difference in contagious illness. And of course, right now, this is top of mind with COVID, that, you know, it's very, very important to practice good hygiene. But there is this, again, unforeseen consequence that has impacted our microbiome. You know, I'll just add that the most diverse microbiome that's been studied in a Western world is an order of magnitude less diverse than those in a hunter-gatherer tribe. So it's the most diverse person in our community is way less diverse in their microbiome than somebody eating a traditional diet, living in a traditional kind of way with the earth. And I think that's significant. So our microbiome can be further disrupted by things like antibiotics. Again, sometimes antibiotics are necessary and they can be life-saving, but again, they can cause unforeseen consequences. And sometimes they're used inappropriately, like for a viral ear infection, that's a problem. And, you know, pediatricians are working very hard to reduce this, but this really impacts the gut microbiome. Every time you get antibiotics, it's going to reduce that diversity and have an impact. And then the foods we feed infants also impacts what bacteria grow. You know, this is not what we evolved eating, and this changes which bacteria are going to be predominant because different bacteria are going to thrive on different foods. So this is sort of your worst case scenario here, but the standard American diet is not promoting the bacteria we want to promote. It has a very different impact than a whole foods diet. So why is this microbiome so gosh darn important if I'm talking about it so much? Well, it has a lot of roles. First of all, in infancy and early childhood, it's really educating your immune system about who is a friend and who is a foe. So, you know, these bacteria are not part of us, but we want our immune system to accept them as a friend and not something to fight off, and to recognize when something is actually a pathogen. It's interesting to note that the bacteria that causes ulcers, H. pylori, doesn't seem to cause ulcers when people contract it when they're very, very young, but does cause ulcers when it's contracted later. And I think this is where that comes into play, is that it was recognized as a friend and then is not fought off by the immune system in the same way, and doesn't cause the same inflammation. The microbiome also affects your gut leakiness or intestinal permeability, which I'm going to explain more about in a minute. But having a healthy microbiome will help you have healthy intestinal permeability. These microbes produce all kinds of chemicals. Some of these are neurotransmitters. Some of these are chemical messengers of inflammation called cytokines. And these affect inflammation in the gut and also in the entire body. And again, that includes your brain. The microbiome helps you break down and liberate more nutrients from your foods, including amino acids, vitamins, and essential fatty acids like omega-3s. They produce short-chain fatty acids, the healthy bacteria do. And those short-chain fatty acids are critical for your health of your colon. In fact, the cells lining your colon, your own cells, use short-chain fatty acids produced by bacteria for food. So do other beneficial bacteria. And the microbiome also provides more antioxidants to your system by breaking down plant compounds called phenols. These neurochemicals produced by the microbiome, when it's the beneficial bacteria, can calm the nervous system. They also produce something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like growth hormone for your brain. That's very, very important for maintaining good connections between neurons and preventing atrophy of neurons. So when things are out of balance, you can have too many bacteria or pathogenic bacteria, which would be, quote unquote, bad bacteria that can produce harmful chemicals and compounds that can cause inflammation. They can damage your cellular energy capacity by hurting your mitochondria. That's a big problem. So there's a lot of ways that the bacteria impact you. Another way is that some of them actually produce these chemical messengers that induce sleep, that allow you to fall asleep. So an imbalance there could cause insomnia. I had a patient that told me that she used to have very bad insomnia. And then she noticed that when she got her dental, she had a lot of pockets in her gums. And when she got that addressed, her insomnia went away. And this is when we first met, she told me this. She said, "Isn't that weird?" And I'm like, actually, it sounds weird, but it's not, because this is the connection. The bacteria living in those pockets were interfering with her induction of sleep. So there's an important term for the microbiome to know, and that's called dysbiosis. And that's when there's any kind of imbalance in the gut bacteria or even yeast. So dysbiosis can mean an overgrowth of normal bacteria. So they're normally healthy, but when there's too many, that becomes a problem. And it can mean an overgrowth in the wrong location, like the small intestine, because remember, you want your bacteria in the large intestine. Small intestine is where you absorb your food. It's not where we want to be feeding bacteria. Dysbiosis can mean pathogenic overgrowth. It can mean too many yeast present. I see that a lot in my practice. And it can mean a lack of diversity, so not enough variety of bacteria. And it can also just mean not enough beneficial bacteria. That's a deficiency dysbiosis. So the normal intestinal lining should look like this graphic here, where those cells are packed tightly together like bricks, and nothing can get between them. And they're locked together by something called a tight junction. And this prevents particles of bacteria or toxins or undigested food particles to cross out of the gut, across the lining and into your bloodstream. These things should stay in the gut. When there's an increase in intestinal permeability, we have what we call colloquially leaky gut. And this is when the tight junctions open up, and you can see what happens here. Now there's space for bacterial particles or large proteins or bigger toxins to pass between the cells and go right into the bloodstream. And that's where your immune system is patrolling. And so your immune system sees these invaders and these foreign items and wants to attack them. That will turn on inflammation. So what causes that increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut? Well, actually, the overgrowth of the wrong bacteria or yeast alone can cause it. again, there's just a really delicate balance between the components of our microbiome and the health of our gut lining. They interact. So when that's out of balance, it triggers leaky gut. Not having enough beneficial bacteria will contribute to this quite a bit. And an infection, like a parasite infection, can cause this. So parasites turn out not to be rare at all. When I was in medical school, we were trained to ask, have you traveled recently? And if they'd traveled, then we might want to be concerned about parasites. But it turns out you don't have to go anywhere to get a lot of these. And I see these all the time in my practice. And I even experienced 2 of these myself without having gone anywhere at all. Here's some examples of ones I commonly see: Blastocystis hominis, Giardia, Entamoeba histolytica, also Dientamoeba fragilis is not on this list, but I see it a lot. These are a big problem. They cause leaky gut as well. And the big thing I see them cause is problems with gut motility. If your gut isn't squeezing and pushing food down properly, that leads to a lot of problems. And this can trigger other systemic problems. Other causes of leaky gut include ibuprofen and other nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories. Birth control pills can cause leaky gut through hormonal effects. High blood sugar can cause leaky gut, and just inflammatory foods. So highly processed omega-6 oils, sugar, refined grains. I'll talk more about this later, but these things really trigger leaky gut. And then stress. Stress is a very big one, and it's sometimes the hardest one to manage. And when I mention stress, I want to really explain I have a very broad definition of stress. We're used to thinking of it for sure as emotional, or like our to-do list, or relationship stress. But in addition to these psychological and emotional stressors, there's physical stress, like illness in the body, infection, injury. But lack of sleep is a big stressor for our bodies. Lack of community. This is actually something that we are really programmed to need. We need some touch. We need interaction with other people or pets. This is one of the hardest things and saddest things I think about the situation with COVID is people are lacking touch and they're isolated. I mentioned injury and also over-exercise. Exercising too much is a stressor on the body, as are toxins. So all of these can contribute to leaky gut. And that stress has some other impacts too that I want to cover, because it really does affect our gut in multiple ways. Stress will impair your immune function in your gut. And when you're stressed out, it decreases blood flow to your intestines. You're in what's called the sympathetic or fight or flight state instead of the parasympathetic or rest and digest state. And amazingly, the stress will actually change the mix of bacteria present in the gut. And as mentioned, it causes leaky gut. So what is the problem with having this leaky gut? I mean, you saw how bacterial components, toxins, food can trigger the immune system. Well, that leads to a whole cascade of reactions. And that inflammation that's the result of that affects the whole body, including the brain. Your immune system can actually form antibodies to these proteins like gluten or casein from dairy or from other foods, other things like lectins from foods, or pieces of bacteria like LPS, that's called the lipopolysaccharide that's on a lot of bacteria. That's really inflammatory. And when you form antibodies to these things, your immune system is trying to target them and label them and eliminate them. But those antibodies may cross-react with parts of your own tissue that resemble in some way that protein or that bacterial component. Now your body is attacking your own tissue, and that's autoimmune disease. So there are so many symptoms of leaky gut. Certainly skin symptoms, brain symptoms, in addition to gut symptoms like bloating and gas. Joint pain is a really big one. Having increasing food sensitivities, like becoming more and more sort of quote unquote allergic or intolerant to a lot of foods, is a sign that there's a really leaky gut. And then mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, brain fog, trouble concentrating, and then just any kind of chronic inflammation is going to be affected by leaky gut and worsened by that. So you may have heard of this term as the gut is your second brain. And that's because of all these connections between the gut and the brain. you've already heard me talk about some of the chemicals that are made by bacteria and how that can influence the brain. That's the first mechanism that the brain and the gut communicate. So that's via the bloodstream. These cytokines are inflammatory or pro or anti-inflammatory messengers, and of course neurotransmitters that interact with our neurons. But there are two other ways that are known so far that the gut and brain connect and communicate. One is also via the lymphatic system, which is in charge of sort of taking out the trash, so to speak, and removing toxins from the body. And then the third way is via the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. That vagus means wandering nerve. And it goes from your brain stem through your entire abdomen and chest, and it innervates your heart and your intestines, your pancreas, all of these organs. And it controls digestion, breathing, sweating, heart rate. It's responsible for slowing your heart rate. And amazingly, that there are molecules produced by bacteria that actually travel up the nerve to the brain. It's called chemotaxis. Now so you can see the gut communicates in several ways with the brain. And of course, the brain is communicating back to the gut through nerves and also through hormones. And what's so fascinating is there are these studies that show that mice that lack a normal microbiome have different behaviors and different hormone levels, particularly the stress hormone cortisol, and lower brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But if you take the bacteria from, those mice show this risk-taking behavior, right? Not normal behavior. But you take bacteria from a regular mouse that acts timidly, and you put it in the risk-taking mouse. That risk-taking mouse will become timid, and the opposite is true as well. So just switching out their microbiome will actually completely change their behavior. I mentioned the fight or flight state. That's the sympathetic nervous system. This is important for emergencies. This helps us flee from predators, helps us protect ourselves. And when that's happening, the blood is rushing to our brain and our muscles to help us figure out how to get out of the crisis and how to run away. And it pretty much shuts off the functions in the gut, lowers the blood flow there. It turns off digestion, turns off the motility, because you don't need to be digesting when you're running from a tiger. However, if you're in fight or flight all the time because of stress or trauma, then you can see that it's going to have a really big negative impact on your gut. If you can't digest, you're going to have a whole host of problems. So one of the ways that you can help improve your digestion is to actually trigger the parasympathetic nervous system by slowing down, sitting down, really preparing for your food mentally, and taking some slow, deep breaths. I can't stress how much such a simple thing can make a big difference, because think about that. You're allowing now the enzymes to start flowing. You're allowing the acid in your stomach to be produced, and you're helping set things up so that you'll actually break down your food and absorb it and keep the bacteria where they're supposed to be in the large intestine and keep things moving in the right way. If you're in that fight or flight state, you're going to end up with low stomach acid, poor release of digestive enzymes, poor gallbladder function. You know, your gallbladder stores bile from the liver and squirts it all out at once when you eat, because it's going to help break the fat down into little tiny particles to absorb. And it's going to lower blood flow to the intestines when you're in fight or flight state, as I mentioned, decreasing the motility. And then you won't have this very important thing that happens between meals, especially overnight, called the migrating motor complex. That is a cleansing, squeezing wave that just basically wrings out your intestine and just shoves all the bacteria back down to large intestine where they belong. But if that's not going on, the bacteria are moving up into your small intestine and really enjoying all the food you're eating there that you were supposed to be absorbing for yourself. So this is going to lead to a lot of problems with digestion. You're going to experience bloating or GI discomfort or pain. Heartburn is a really common problem because now you've got that pressure building up. It's forcing the acid the wrong way up into your esophagus. This leads to poor absorption of nutrients, and that alone can lead to depression and anxiety because you're lacking key nutrients for your neurons. It's going to lead to bacterial and yeast overgrowth because they're not kept where they're supposed to be. And it's going to cause leaky gut because now you've got bacteria irritating the lining of your small intestine. So both anxiety and depression have been associated in studies with high levels of inflammation, both systemically and in the intestine. They're very tightly connected. We see low brain-derived neurotrophic factor in anxiety and depression. We see high levels of the stress hormone cortisol and an overactive stress response. And we see increased gut permeability or leakiness of the gut. We know from studies that lack of breastfeeding as an infant is associated with a higher rate of depression. And now that can make sense to you after you see how if you don't have enough bifidobacterium or beneficial bacteria, you are going to be at risk for more inflammation, and that's going to be connected to depression. And there is a study that shows that actually giving a bifidobacterium probiotic can be as effective as citalopram, which is Celexa, which is an antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication. There was a study in UCLA that showed that if you gave a probiotic yogurt, it changed the way people reacted when they were looking at pictures of angry or frightened faces. So that's done in an MRI, and they're measuring their brain's reactivity. And the idea is that when you're calm, you're less reactive. And so when the brain is in a healthy, low inflammatory state, you're able to roll with things better. But when there's inflammation, you're easily triggered and you're emotionally very reactive. We see that mice that are fed probiotics have decreased levels of stress hormone, decreased depressive and anxious mouse behaviors. And there are human studies, again, with probiotics showing increased focus on positive information, which is something we see goes away with depression, where we kind of focus on the negative. And they have less anxiety when faced with a stressor and decreased stress hormone. And there have been studies that show that first very important bacteria we get, Bifidobacterium infantis, can calm that stress response. And again, that's happening through the chemicals that these bacteria are making and that are traveling up our vagus nerve and are being absorbed into our bloodstream. So what can we do about all this? We certainly can't go back and change if we were born via C-section. Or, I'm not wanting anyone to stress about that. It's a matter of controlling the things we can control now, because we can actually really shift our microbiome into a healthier place by many things we can do. So managing stress is really, really key. Obviously, reducing stress where we can, and then increasing our stress management techniques to help with the stress that we can't get rid of. So like meditation, making sure we sleep enough. That's one of the best antidotes to stress that there is. Exercise in the right amount, having fun, play. We need to think about that microbiome like another organ and focus on feeding it the right things. So feeding it whole, real foods, lots of fiber. I'm going to give you more detail on that in a minute. We want to avoid the overuse of antibiotics. So I'm certainly not saying that there's no role for antibiotics. I want to be very clear about that. Antibiotics can be critical, but we just want to be strategic about where we use them and understand that we may want to take some action, and if we know we have to have antibiotics, to try to help preserve our gut microbiome. And we want to minimize our exposure to toxins, because those are damaging our gut bacteria that we want to keep in good quantities. So the key thing is it's all about what we eat, because we're eating multiple times a day and these bacteria are consuming that. And what we eat has a direct impact on our gut microbiome. The studies show that your microbiome can shift quite a bit just within a few days of changing your diet. So we want to focus on real whole foods, because this is what we evolved eating. This is what the system expects. So we want to avoid processed foods, and especially like really refined carbohydrates and sugars. Those are quite inflammatory all on their own, and then they really feed the wrong bacteria. We want to avoid food additives, including artificial sweeteners. This is the way that artificial sweeteners are really a problem for us, because you may remember that there was a big push to, like in the 80s, it became very popular to try to reduce your cholesterol and go super low fat. People started eating a lot more carbohydrates, but then they also started introducing more artificial sweeteners, because there was a realization, okay, if we're having, sugary sodas, that's causing a lot of weight gain and diabetes. But the artificial sweeteners actually didn't do any better. People still were getting diabetes. And how can that be? Well, the bacteria can consume these artificial sweeteners, and they are creating inflammation that leads to the insulin resistance with diabetes. So even though it doesn't cause your blood sugar to go up directly, it indirectly has the same negative impact. You want to avoid antibiotics in meats because those antibiotics are going to have an impact on your bacteria. So focus on eating organic and ideally pasture raised meats because they have a much healthier sort of levels of fats and like they have healthy omega-3s and a better profile. You want to eat whole foods because a lot of the components in those foods are going to help feed beneficial bacteria. And you want to increase prebiotic intake. So prebiotics are food for bacteria, whereas probiotics are actual bacteria. The prebiotic intake that's most important to focus on is a wide variety of vegetable fibers. And that actually means eating the rainbow, eating a wide variety of colors, because those different polyphenols that make up the brightly colored foods in vegetables are really, really helpful for beneficial bacteria and will help grow a wide variety of bacteria. You want a lot of different color. Now I want to just mention a word about Eli Metchnikoff because he's the sort of the godfather of probiotics, and he recognized that there was this connection between the health of these people in the Caucasus Mountains and the kefir that they were drinking, which is like a fermented yogurt drink. And he won the Nobel Prize in the end for this recognition. So probiotics, I get a lot of questions about probiotics. And this is just a picture I took actually a couple of years ago, just pulling probiotics out of my fridge. I should take a new one because we have a lot of variety in the fridge right now. But there are so many available these days. And you want to find them in the refrigerated section. If they're not refrigerated, like if it's a canned sauerkraut, there's no probiotic in that. You want the ones that are alive. And there's all kinds of condiments and salsas and kimchis and all kinds of things that are tasty. And here's a list of some of the types of fermented foods. Now, just a word of caution that not everybody will tolerate these because they may be too disruptive to the gut microbiome if things are really out of whack. Sometimes starting really, really slow works well for that. Some people will not tolerate the histamines produced by fermentation, and that's a kind of a bigger issue where it's important to work with a practitioner. But if you don't have any of those problems, fermented foods are a wonderful natural probiotic. And most traditional cultures have some kind of fermented food that they use, usually as a condiment at most meals. And that's just because they figured out over time that this was a really nutrient dense, helpful thing for their system. And part of that was because of the bacteria in the food. Here's some more pictures. There's pickles. These are kefir grains in the top right corner for making kefir. And then that's kimchi on the bottom right, which is cabbage. So fermented foods really are my favorite probiotics. An important thing to know about probiotics, though, is that they don't take up residence in your gut. Most people think of them as like seeds that you're planting in a garden. They actually just pass through. However, that doesn't make them not useful. They're really helpful. As they're passing through, they're interacting with the other bacteria. They're modulating the immune system. They're interacting with your gut lining. They have a big influence. And some of the key bacteria that you'll find in a lot of probiotics are different types of lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, because that's some of that first bacteria that we get. And so those would be normal things to find in a probiotic. So here's one more quote from my favorite guy: "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." Food really is extremely powerful medicine. And I hope tonight you're able to see some of why that is. This is not the only way that food's important, but its impact on the gut microbiome cannot be overstated. We continue to learn every day more about the role of these bacteria and how it interacts with our system and how critical they are. So I want to just tell you a little bit about what I do then with this information with patients. And I told you Carol's story at the beginning, and I want to bring it back to that. So I've sort of condensed my approach into this 5-step system. And the first part is about making the connections, which is what we're doing right now in this talk. You're seeing how these different things relate to each other, and how, you know, maybe if you know, oh, I had all those antibiotics and then my gut never felt quite right after that, that's an important connection. The next step is uncovering the hidden causes. And this is where in my practice, the testing is very, very important, but also careful history taking. And then nourishing and replenishing any missing nutrients, rebalancing body systems from the nervous system to hormones to detoxification. And also this last piece, retraining the brain. I'll explain that in a minute. So with Carol, we mapped her symptoms and events in her life onto this thing called the functional medicine timeline. And we learned that there were some very critical pieces of her story that related to her symptom onset. So one piece that was very important was she'd had to have her gallbladder removed. And, you know, a year, 2 years after that, a lot of symptoms started mounting. And that is a pattern I very commonly see if someone's had a gallbladder removed, because they're not able to emulsify and absorb fats well. And it really disrupts the gut microbiome, because now digestion's not occurring right. And it's a whole like domino effect of symptoms. That was not the only factor. We also realized she had been exposed. She'd been living in a moldy environment, and she hadn't realized there was mold, which is very common. And this was causing a lot of symptoms. And there were other factors as well. So what the step 2 is where we really find the rest of those, and that's in the testing. Here's an example of a piece of one part of a stool test. And this is a really important thing that I do with every patient, whether or not they have gut symptoms. And you can understand now why after tonight's talk, because what's going on in the gut is affecting the whole body. And here you see, look at this, all of these overgrowths. Every single H here means it's too high. So this is a totally overgrown situation in the gut, and that's going to be very inflammatory. And the step 3 is nourish and replenish. In Carol's case, she had very low vitamin D. She had very low vitamin B12 because she didn't have good digestion and therefore not enough stomach acid to absorb vitamin B12. This was leading to a lot of her depression and anxiety, along with the imbalances in the gut bacteria and the mold, as I mentioned. But we focused on getting the key nutrients back in her system and replenishing those, and then really focusing on digestion so that she could then really get the nutrients she needed from food, and work to rebalance her body systems. So helping with detoxification, the mold toxins that she had in her system had really derailed her immune system. So getting her immune system functioning well again, and supporting detoxification so she could get out the toxins we're supposed to be getting out every day. These were key for her. And the last step is retraining the brain. And this is a unique thing that I think I wish more people knew about, because the brain is always really doing its job to try to protect you. And there's this midbrain, your amygdala, the limbic system it's called, is always scanning the environment for any kind of threat to you. And it's doing that to protect you. But through a lifetime of experiences, your brain is going to have learned that certain things are dangerous or a threat. And that's going to create a reaction in your body. And some of that will really be physiological inflammation. And when you heal these different imbalances, you don't need to have that same response to that environmental signal. And without retraining the brain, you can end up stuck with these symptoms, even though you've really fixed the root cause. You need your brain to get the memo that things are better. And in addition to that, you can actually really harness the power of your brain to lower inflammation and to speed healing. So this is, to me, kind of like the secret sauce of our program, because this really helps maximize how much better you can get and speed up the process. So for Carol, she found this very, very helpful, and now is enjoying feeling just amazing. And now is focused on, okay, now I'm all better. What do I need to do to stay better? She's got all kinds of wonderful habits in place. And really, it's just about checking in and maintaining the great skills that she's developed. So I want to just end with something that I'm excited to tell you about. You guys will be the first people to hear about this. But for quite a while, I'd say like 2 years, I've really wanted to have some kind of course or online program so that I could get this information to more people and they could benefit from what I know helps without having to become a patient. And, it's more accessible and just get those foundations in place that can make so much of a difference. And so I'm excited to tell you that in just a few weeks, I'm actually launching a program, an online program called the Gut Brain Transformation. It's about overcoming depression, anxiety, and brain fog without medication. And so I'm going to be starting to tell people about that in the next 2 weeks, basically. And that program will be launching and starting in early February. And so I just want to let you guys know that that's coming in case that sounds like something you would want to participate in, because it's going to be really the distillation of all that I've learned with working with my patients. That is just the key things that make the difference. So this is not going to be medical care. This is an educational program. And you will be able to take this information and apply it to your life and start to improve your digestion, figure out food triggers, shift your microbiome, harness the power of your brain to reduce inflammation so that you can really work with your body's natural healing ability to feel better. So I'm super excited about that. What we're going to do is as soon as the replay for this is ready, the co-op will send out a link so that you can sign up to get the replay. And also you can get as a gift to you, my top 10 overlooked causes of depression, anxiety, and brain fog free guide. So you look for that email soon because you'll be able to get those 2 things, and then you'll be on our mailing list, and I'll be able to let you know when the Gut Brain Transformation online program is going to be available, which, like I said, is just in a couple weeks. So I'm super excited about that. I'm really passionate about people knowing this stuff and getting better and with, naturally the way we're supposed to be able to function. So excited to share that with you. Now I would love to open it up for questions. So I'm going to stop this slideshow. And okay, what we can do is take questions in the chat or the Q&A. We have a couple options. And you can also raise your hand if you would like, and I can call on you and you can actually ask your question live. So go ahead and do that. And I just want to stress too, I'm really happy to answer questions, but this is just general information. I can't offer any medical advice, obviously, but just want to be able to at least point you in the right direction. Okay, first question is do I have any tips for fighting sugar cravings? Yeah, and she says her addiction is hurting her microbiome the most. Yeah, that's a tricky thing, right? Because you feel kind of stuck and captured by these cravings. Well, it can be a vicious cycle because often sugar cravings are to do with yeast overgrowth, and the yeast will really make you want sugar. And so it's a bit of a vicious cycle. But there are a lot of components to that. Sometimes it's really about balancing blood sugar. So things that'll improve blood sugar are making sure you're eating a really balanced macronutrient diet. So what I mean by that is having enough. What I usually see is people are having too many carbs and they're not having enough fats and not having enough protein with their meals. But if they do that, if they incorporate the protein and the fat, and they're relaxing before they eat, deep breathing, making sure they're really going to digest that well, then they won't have the blood sugar spikes that can result in the crashes of blood sugar that make you really crave sugar. So that is one of the key pieces I think that can help with sugar cravings. Okay, the next question is how much fiber is a good amount to strive for? That is a great question. So we think historically people really consumed about 30 grams of fiber, and now most people get something like maybe 10 or 11 grams on average. So you really want to up that. And my favorite way is really more and more vegetables. The more vegetables, the better. It's not even just the fiber, it's the, like I said, it's the phytonutrients, the colors, the polyphenols, like, think of like red cabbage, for example, brightly colored vegetables make a huge difference. And really just having the fiber and the variety of plant chemicals of all the colors is going to promote that healthy microbiome. Okay, another question. What do I think about fasting? Yeah, so fasting can be a really, really healthy strategy. It does depend, though. Not everybody is really set up to be good with fasting. If you have a lot of stress in your life, fasting might really be detrimental. There's times where it might be better to do fasting versus other times. But fasting can be a great way to help your gut because you're making sure you give it enough time to do that migrating motor complex, that cleansing wave that's going to squeeze the bacteria back down to where they belong. That happens when you're not eating. And also, fasting can really help to sensitize you to insulin again. So, having better blood sugar and help fight off insulin resistance, which is sort of like the first step towards diabetes. There's also a question here I'm going to answer at the same time because it's related, which is the fasting mimicking diet. What do I think of that? You know, I was just talking about that with a patient today. I think the fasting mimicking diet can be a fabulous tool for improving insulin sensitivity, and it allows you to have all kinds of stem cell activation and kind of clean up damaged cells. You know, it certainly would not have a negative impact on the gut microbiome, and it might be beneficial. But I think it sort of has a different mechanism of action than necessarily gut microbiome. But I think it can be a very useful tool for a number of things. Question here, fermented foods are better than a probiotic? Question. Well, you know, the reason I like fermented foods is it's more of a whole food. It's more of what makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. And I tend to look at things through that lens. There are other things in it besides probiotic bacteria, right? There's also nutrients from the actual food that's there that have been liberated by the bacteria. So it's really nutrient dense. Probiotics can be very helpful, and I use targeted probiotics all the time in my practice. But I really like people to eat fermented foods because it's very much like giving your body a little bit all the time of what can really help shift that microbiome. The question though, can you eat too much fermented foods? Absolutely. I mean, if you are experiencing GI distress, that was too much for you. Again, you can ease into it and usually start to tolerate more. Or as I mentioned, if you have a histamine intolerance, fermented foods can feel terrible. Okay, next question. Let me see, I gotta go over to Q&A because there's lots of questions. Okay. This is a long one, hang on a second. So Laura talks about having read a book called Elimination Diet, and several people, she did the diet together for 8 months, and the people who did it saw significant decreases in depression, decline in inflammation, increase in energy. And would I recommend a total elimination diet? Well, and you're saying focusing on removing most foods known to cause IBS and leaky gut and slowly adding them back in one at a time. Okay, a word about elimination diets. They are a wonderful tool to identify food triggers. And they can be, elimination diet can mean a lot of things. It can mean just removing gluten and dairy. It can mean removing all kinds of foods. It depends. But the goal there is to take them out of the diet long enough to see if symptoms improve. And if they do improve, then introducing things one at a time to figure out which one is the trigger. And that is the gold standard for identifying problematic foods and food intolerances. So I do recommend people do that. But we always have to kind of balance that against making things overly restrictive and causing sort of too much stress in the process. And then there's a question about gallbladders, people without a gallbladder, and what to do to preserve a healthy gut. Yeah, I mean, I would really recommend working with a practitioner because there's probably a lot of things to untangle there. But basically, you want to be supporting digestion of fats. That's what's going to really be important because that's what got impaired. Does having bariatric surgery affect what I've talked about? Yes, it can, absolutely. I mean, you've shortened your small intestine, and it also has it can cause decreases in nutrient absorption. So you have to pay extra attention to making sure that you are getting everything you need, and usually requires additional supplementation to make sure that that's occurring. So another case where it's good to work with someone who is skilled in identifying those deficiencies. But the microbiome is still there and really still needs attention. Do I recommend an anti-inflammatory diet for anxiety? Absolutely. Absolutely. That can make an enormous difference. So can balancing blood sugar. That can be a major trigger for anxiety. But yes, inflammation triggered by food is so common, and just getting inflammatory processed foods out of the diet can make a tremendous amount of difference in how you feel. Okay, question about what are my thoughts on temporary low FODMAP diet to decrease leaky gut? Okay, low FODMAP diet. That FODMAP is an acronym that relates to different kinds of sugars. And some people with IBS can feel better on a low FODMAP diet because they have something called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But FODMAP foods are mostly really healthy. So I don't like to see people on a low FODMAP diet long term. I like to use it more diagnostically, like remove the FODMAPs, which is, by the way, not an easy diet to do. Remove those for several weeks and see if you have improvement, and then introduce those groups back in one at a time. Like the F stands for fructans, for example. You introduce the different foods and see which ones are you really reacting to. Because if it's just one category, then you may be able to do pretty well eating a pretty broad diet, but just avoiding those one things. But to really be able to solve the problem of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you need to not only treat the bacterial overgrowth, you have to find out why it occurred in the first place, which is one of the key things I focus on in my practice. And I see missed all the time. People with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, get antibiotics after antibiotics, and they'll feel good for a while, and then it comes back, and it's going to keep coming back unless you treat the root cause. Okay, well, we got a lot of questions, so I'm going to just take a few more, and then we're going to have to wrap up. But I love how interactive you guys are all. I appreciate the questions. What's my opinion on a low lectin diet? Well, lectins are proteins in a lot of different plants that can trigger your immune system. This is generally an issue more for people who have autoimmune disease. So it can be helpful to do that as a type of elimination diet to find out which are the key triggers. And again, I think it's so great to identify dietary triggers, but when most of the triggers are healthy foods, it means there needs to be gut healing so that you don't keep becoming more intolerant. And hopefully you can reintroduce some of those foods once there's been more gut healing. Thoughts on raw versus cooked vegetables. When you have a lot of intestinal problems and problems with digestion, it can be very helpful to focus on cooked foods because they can be much more digestible. And this is true with like bloating from small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And, then you can shift towards more raw foods as they're better tolerated. But, I'm not somebody who thinks that cooking is bad for food. I think that certainly sometimes it can decrease certain nutrients, but it can also liberate certain nutrients. So I think a mixed diet is optimal. Can the vagus nerve be affected by massage? That's a great question. Yeah, a lot of things can affect the vagus nerve. Gargling can affect the vagus nerve, singing loudly, which you can do, like say in your car with the doors closed, that, if you're on your own, you're trying to improve your vagal tone, that can help. There's several things that can really improve vagus nerve function. But yeah, anything that's going to help you relax is going to help that as well. And getting your vagus nerve functioning well is going to help your digestion. Okay, a couple more questions. Okay, let's see. Is there a cure for histamine intolerance? I think that'll be one of the last couple ones. That is a great question. So I do feel like you can get a lot of improvement with histamine intolerance. It can be a hard problem to fix. Some people's histamine intolerance is related to something called mast cell activation syndrome, which is a very frustrating problem to have. But there are root causes for these. They are things like gut bacterial imbalances, toxins like mold exposure. There's a whole list. And so if you can identify the root causes and really improve those, you can get a lot of relief. Some people also have a genetic reason that they tolerate histamine less, but there can be some simple support that can make a difference for that. So yeah, there's a lot of hope for histamine intolerance. And then what can one do to relieve acid indigestion without using drugs? Yeah, really focusing on improving the gut microbiome and the digestion so that there's not this pressure forcing acid reflux up into the esophagus. So finding food triggers, is big. One of the huge things I've seen is just people cutting out processed foods, like especially refined carbohydrates. Many people will get relief from heartburn just from that alone. And then, you know, if that's not enough, working with someone to really treat gut imbalances and really using good support to optimize digestion. Okay. Well, I think that is the all we've got time for tonight, but I really appreciate everybody with all these great questions. And, you know, I hope tonight's information was helpful to you and that you'll be able to take some of this information into your own life to help shift your own health to a better place and start feeling better. Thank you all for coming, and look for the email that we're going to send out that's going to give you an opportunity to get my guide on 10 overlooked causes of depression, anxiety, and brain fog, and also for the replay for this. And then you can be signed up on the list to hear about the gut brain transformation program that's coming out soon in case you are interested in that. Thank you all so much for coming. Oh, and I just want to add, Julia from the co-op did mention that co-op is hosting a free class next week at 6 p.m. on IBS with a nutritionist who overcame IBS. So if that's of interest to you, make sure you attend that. The Sacramento Food Co-op classes are wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening.